Both teachers and learners go to sleep at their post as soon as there's no enemy in the field. Welcome to Philosophers, explained by me, Stephen Hicks. This series covers major philosophers and core texts in philosophy, especially the great classics, which are classics for good reason. From each, I've selected an excerpt, 30-40 minutes, no more than an hour, and the idea is to have an introduction to an important work. We'll do a close reading with the accompanying text. In this episode, we're turning to John Stuart Mill, chapter 2 of his great work on liberty of 1859, and his rousing and deeply historically informed defense of free thought and free expression. Published in perhaps the most liberal and liberalizing century in human history. Let's go to the text. All right, of the liberty of thought and discussion, it's worth pointing from the outset that it's not just the liberty of discussion, it's not just the liberty of thought, but there needs to be an integration of those two. The purpose of thinking is for the purpose of externalizing it as well. So thought that you are not allowed to express or expression that's not grounded in free thinking are equally going to be useless. So it's a comprehensive defense that Mill is going to offer in this chapter. Now, he starts by putting things in a historical context, noting that the great liberalizing of the Enlightenment, late 1600s, 1700s, and now substantially into the 1800s, has been enormously successful, and so he can start rather optimistically. The time, it is hoped, is gone when any defense would be necessary of the liberty of the press as one of the securities against tyrannical government. So that battle has by and large been won. And so free speech is the dominant position due to the success of liberal arguments. But he then immediately goes into a possible counter-argument that say maybe we don't need to have any assurances of the freedom of the press and checks against the tyrannical government and so on, now that we are in democratic and republican times, because it's not the case that there's the government against the people anymore. It's not the government for the people or over the people, but rather what we now have is government of the people and government by the people. So do things change at all? Then Mill wants to ask in this next paragraph. So let us suppose, therefore, that the government is entirely at one with the people and never thinks of exerting any power of coercion unless in agreement with what it conceives to be their voice. The voice of the people is the voice of the government. So is freedom of expression necessary there, or if the government of the people decides that it wants to restrict certain thoughts and certain forms of expression, is it now appropriate? And Mill says, no, I deny the right of the people to exercise such coercion, either by themselves or by their government. The power itself is illegitimate. And then a couple of lines later, this rousing sentence, if all mankind minus one were of one opinion and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. So of the individual, freedom of thought and freedom of expression is absolute power. To silence that is an illegitimate power. And so what Mill is arguing is if we were to put kind of extreme monarchies at one end of the spectrum and extreme democracies at the other end of the spectrum, and say monarchy is one person having power over the rest, at the other end of the spectrum, it would be democracies having power over the one person or any individual. It's not a matter of the legitimacy of either of those. They're both equally illegitimate. That's not the proper extent of power. People should be free. Now, what's interesting here, and I'm going to substitute a quote, is that Mill from chapter 1, we're now into chapter 2, had argued that he's not going to appeal to any doctrine of rights, inalienable rights, absolute rights, God-given rights, natural rights. The idea being that ahead of time, or a priori, or in any absolute general principle sense, we can say there are these binding rights that should apply to all circumstances and that free speech is one of those rights. He does not believe philosophically in the doctrine of rights, and as he puts it, instead he is an advocate of utility. That is to say, we are evaluating the goodness or the badness of actions by their results, right? by their consequences, and that requires that it means that we need to investigate the consequences in particular circumstances, and we might be appealing to general rules of thumb and so forth, but there's not any absolute, universal, binding, general set of principles that we can just apply in a top-down fashion, independent of any considerations of utility and consequences. The cases that he makes are in terms of the consequences of principles, and so he's going to be arguing for free speech in terms of its beneficial consequences and against any form of censorship in terms of its negative consequences. And so he goes on to indicate at the end of this paragraph what such consequences of censorship are. But the peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race, posterity, as well as the existing generation, those who dissent from the opinion, still more than those who hold it. If the opinion is right, then they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. All right, so the consequences of censorship are bad, whether the opinions are to be expressed are true or false. And it's that taxonomy that Mill is going to use to structure the rest of it's actually a fairly substantially long chapter, this chapter 2. That opinions can be true or false. And then one line of argument is going to be, well, what happens if we censor false opinions? And what are the consequences of that? And then on the other hand, well, suppose the opinion that we are going to censor is true. What are the consequences of that going to be? And he's going to argue in both cases the consequences are bad or negative. There is a third alternative where, when we're dealing with complex issues, an opinion that is itself a complex contains some measure of truth and some measure of falsity, and the competing opinion or opinions also contain some measures of truth and falsity, and censoring under those circumstances, he's also going to argue, is bad in terms of its consequences. So let's turn to the first wing of the argument. Not necessarily the best metaphor, because birds don't have 3 wings, and this is going to be a majorly tripart distinction here. So let's start off with the assumption. Any given opinion, and we're thinking about censoring it. Maybe that opinion is true. First, the opinion which it is attempted to suppress by authority may be true, possibly. Now, of course, the people who are wanting to suppress that opinion almost never think that that's a true opinion, but it might still be true, unless you are assuming your own infallibility and you that can't possibly be wrong on this or any other issue. And that's what Mill wants to point out. You might think that you are correct, and you may in fact be correct, but if you are going to assume your correctness in order to express an opinion, then you are assuming your own infallibility. All silencing of discussion is an assumption of infallibility. Now, Mill then immediately goes on to consider a counter-argument. Well, maybe we don't have to assume that we are infallible. Maybe nobody is in fact knowing everything or knowing everything perfectly. We're just acting on our best judgment, and our best judgment right now is that that's a wrong opinion, so we don't want to suppress that, and maybe we'll change our minds in various other points. So Mill wants to say that no, what you are still doing is a certain kind of assuming your infallibility. I answer right to that kind of argument. It's assuming very much more. There is the greatest difference between presuming an opinion to be true, okay, whatever level of certainty you're ascribing to the opinion that you are presuming to be true, because with every opportunity for contesting it, it has not been refuted, and assuming its truth for the purpose of not permitting its refutation. Those are two very different cases. Even if you don't think you have the absolute truth, you've got something that's pretty good or a pretty strong opinion, having that opinion under the circumstance where you have allowed that opinion to be subject to possible refutation, that's one thing. Having what you think is a pretty good opinion, but you think it's a pretty good opinion and you haven't allowed it to be subjected to possible refutation, that's a different thing, and that's closer to assuming a certain kind of infallibility or excerpting your opinion from any challenge that might undermine your authority. The only reason we have, or the only good reasons that we have for having reliability in our opinions, whatever degree of reliability, is that we've gone through that process. And that's this section in blue here. Complete liberty of contradicting and disproving our opinion is the very condition which justifies us in assuming its truth for purposes of action. And on no other terms can a being with human faculties have any rational assurance of being right. So, Mill then turns to history and asks us to consider the long history of opinion. And Mill is a progressive. He thinks that we have in fact made progress in the sciences and in our morals and in our politics. And he asks us to reflect on, given the long sweep of human history, what has made it possible for us to make whatever progress we have made. Consider either the history of opinion or the ordinary conduct of human life. To what is it to be ascribed that the one and the other are no worse than they are? Not certainly to the inherent force of the human understanding. It's not just because we are inherently intelligent and brilliant and able to solve all sorts of problems. And he goes on to point out what might seem a rather sobering assessment of the vast majority of human beings, but on any matter not self-evident, there are 99 persons totally incapable of judging it for one who is capable. So take any complicated matter, physics, chemistry, foreign policy, and so forth. 99% of the population don't have a great understanding of what that issue is and an informed judgment on it. 1 person in 100 does, and that's going to be a certain kind of person. But he then wants to argue even that 1 in 100 person, the capacity of the 100th person is only comparative. Even the eminent individuals of our generation, of past generations, who've thought long and hard about certain things, have been completely wrong or entertained all kinds of bizarre opinions as well. So what has enabled us to make the progress that we have? And again, what is it then, or why is it rather then, that there is on the whole a preponderance among mankind of rational opinions and rational conduct? And he goes on to argue down here, for human being, the source of everything respectable in man, either as an intellectual or as a moral being, is that namely his errors are corrigible, correctable, fixable. He is capable of rectifying his mistakes. He's going to make lots and lots of mistakes, but he's going to be capable of rectifying them by discussion and experience. Not by experience alone. There must be discussion to show how experience is to be interpreted. Wrong opinions and practices gradually yield to fact and argument. But facts and arguments to produce any effect on the mind must be brought before it. So progress depends on correcting errors. Correcting errors depends on lots and lots of discussion and being open to lots and lots of discussion. Suppressing opinions, even if you think you've got a pretty good opinion and the other opinion is pretty wrong, short circuits that, undercuts that process, and is then going to undermine our continued progress. And it may in fact cause us to go backwards in terms of the progress that we have already made. If you want to say you are a person of good judgment, or to take any person at any time who is a person of good judgment, what makes good judgment possible? In the case of any person whose judgment is really deserving of confidence, how has it become so? Because he has kept his mind open to criticism of his opinions and conduct. Because it has been his practice to listen to all that could be said against him, to profit by as much of it as was just, and so forth. Goes on a little bit later. No wise man ever acquired his wisdom in any mode but this. There's no magic good judgment pill. Right? There's no kazam, or divine intervention that just sprinkles truth on some people or good judgment on people. It takes effort. It takes an open mind. It takes making lots of mistakes, keeping yourself open to correcting those mistakes, and that requires listening to other people with different ways of looking at things who are willing to point out the problems in your way of thinking. That's what we need to do as individuals, and that needs to be our social policy with respect to discussion of any sort of matter that we are interested in making progress on. Next paragraph, he indicates the Catholic Church. He indicates, again, looking at its historical record, that the Catholic Church has been the most intolerant of churches. But even the Roman Catholic Church, he wants to argue, institutes this policy when it's doing insignificant things like considering the canonization of a saint. It doesn't just automatically go ahead and do so, or just go in the opinion of a few people. It indicates the policy of the devil's advocate. It keeps open to what could possibly be criticisms of the candidate for sainthood, and it takes those criticisms seriously before exercising its ultimate judgment. Now, what we are doing is considering the possibility that we might be wrong, that maybe we are not infallible. And so even though we think we have something that is true and that the belief that we are thinking about censoring is false, we need to be wary, particularly in the light of history. And he goes on then, John Stuart Mill, to point out some very important historical lessons. So he takes the case of Socrates, perhaps the most famous of all philosophers ever. He goes on to argue, or point out rather, not only was Socrates a wise man in his judgment, he was a wise man in the judgment of all sorts of wise people over the course of the 2,000 years since Socrates' death. Not only that, Socrates was a great inspiration to Plato and to Aristotle, to other giants from whom we can all learn a huge number of people. What was the attitude, though, of the authorities or of the majority opinion in Athens with respect to Socrates? And he goes on to point, this is the greatest philosopher perhaps of the day and perhaps of the millennium. He was put to death by his countrymen after a judicial conviction for impiety and immorality. So they thought they were right, they thought Socrates was wrong, and they put the guy to death. So one important example. A few centuries later, the example of Jesus, what happened to Jesus, the event which took place on Calvary, now 1,800 years ago from Mill's perspective in the 1800s. So Jesus had his ideas, his opinions, his conduct of character, and yet the authorities of his era thought he was immoral or bad guy and put him to death for blasphemy. All right, was that a mistake by the authorities of the time who thought that they were doing the right thing? Another example, just a few centuries later, a couple of centuries later actually, Marcus Aurelius, one of the great Stoic philosophers, a man of extraordinarily good judgment and judicious temperament and a civilized human being. And we read his meditations and all of us are impressed by the depth and humanity of his thought. But nonetheless, even so great a human being as Marcus Aurelius made a huge mistake. This man, a better Christian than in all but the dogmatic sense of the word, than almost any of the ostensibly Christian sovereigns who have since reigned, persecuted Christianity. So even Marcus Aurelius was intolerant and thought he was making a good judgment in persecuting Christians. So take these examples in mind, right? What the people who thought they were right did to Socrates, what the people who thought they were right did to Jesus, what the Marcus Aurelius did to the Christians. And there are lots and lots of other examples in history. Now, you might be a pretty smart person, you might be a pretty decent person, and you might have some power, but be very careful that you are not being dogmatically arrogant and assuming that in some sense you can't be wrong, particularly with respect to wanting to censor and suppress other people's ideas. Now, Mill goes on to consider an interesting argument from Dr. Johnson, who says, well, look, it's true. Lots of times these great people get persecuted. Socrates was persecuted, Jesus was persecuted, and so on. But they have good ideas, and we don't really need to worry about the persecution in the long run because the good ideas will out. They will prove their worth. And maybe in the short term they will have some setbacks, but you can't keep a good idea down, so to speak. And maybe we should even see the persecution of these ideas as a kind of test. And if they pass the test, they earn a kind of badge of honor. And Mill goes on to argue in the next paragraph that that's a completely bad argument on historical grounds. The dictum that truth always triumphs over persecution is one of those pleasant falsehoods which men repeat one after another until they pass into commonplaces, but which all experience refutes. It is simply not the case that the truth always out. And he goes on to say, history teems with instances of truth put down by persecution for decades, for centuries, for millennia. And in many cases, it's merely accidental that a good idea or a true idea is resuscitated in later times. And he goes on to give just a long list of merely religious ideas, not necessarily artistic ideas or political ideas or scientific ideas, just lots and lots of ideas that seem like pretty good ideas that are a credit to human beings that were suppressed successfully for huge amounts of time. So we can't be complacent and say that the truth will out and persecution is just one more test that we wanted to go through. He then brings things to modern times and says, we have made a lot of progress on this. He goes on to say, for example, using some carrying on in the religious history example, it is true that we no longer put heretics to death. So that's a mark of progress. And the amount of penal infliction which modern feeling would probably tolerate, even against the most obnoxious opinions, is not sufficient to extirpate them. So we have made some progress, but let's be careful. Let's not flatter ourselves that we are entirely out of the woods on this, or that we can't fall back or go backwards, so to speak, to earlier historical attitudes. And then he gives an example from just 2 years before he published the book down in Cornwall, where an unfortunate man who seemed like he was a decent guy, no bad rap sheet with the police or prison time or quarrelsome and so forth, and said he was sent to prison for almost 2 years for saying and writing some offensive words about Christianity. So that intolerance and willing to suppress people for alternative opinions, even in 19th century England, is still a dangerous lurking problem, and it's likely to be a perennial problem given human nature. All right, now Mill carries on for several pages developing historical examples, and then at some point he transitions to the second division of the argument. Prior, we were saying possibly the opinion that we think we are suppressing is true. We think it's false, but it is in fact true. And what are the bad consequences of censorship in those cases? Now let's go over to the other side of the divide and say that we are considering suppressing an opinion as false, and it is in fact a false opinion. So we are correct in our judgment about the falsity of the opinion, and so we are not suppressing a true opinion and losing the benefits of that truth. We are suppressing a false opinion. And what's wrong with suppressing false opinions? After all, false opinions just pollute the mind. If they're put in action, they lead to bad consequences. Why, if we are correct that an opinion is wrong, what's wrong with censoring in that case? So the way Mill puts it here is, let's dismissing the supposition that any of the received opinions may be false, let us assume them to be true. That is to say, our opinions are true but on the basis of our correctly believing something to be true, we are going to hold them under a regime of censorship. Examine the worth of the manner in which they are likely to be held when their truth is not freely and openly canvassed. So we have the truth on whatever set of issues they are, and we're only going to censor the false opinions. What's going to be the effect or the consequences to those truths and the way we believe those truths if we don't have a free speech regime? Now, he gives some education examples here, interestingly, and much of Mill's chapter 2 applies to social policies in general, but is particularly tailored to education and how young people need to be taught. So how should we teach people the truth? And of course, we all, as parents and teachers, want to pass on what we think are the truths to our children and shield them from things that we think are false. So one way of doing so, of course, is just to say, here's a list of things that I think are true, and I tell my students or my children, learn these true things and just believe them because I'm your parent or I'm your teacher. I told you to believe them. So believe these true things on authority, and I am the authority. Now, Mill says, fortunately, we have made progress enough in education and in parenting and schooling not to do that very much anymore, at least particularly compared to earlier eras. There's a class of persons, happily not quite so numerous as formerly, who think it enough if a person assents undoubtingly to what they think true, though he has no knowledge whatever of the grounds of the opinion. And Mill wants to argue that's not really what we call knowledge, right? If you tell me, some mathematical truth, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, Pythagorean theorem, and I just memorize it. I said, and you say to me, Stephen, what is a squared plus b squared when we're talking about right angle triangles? I say, oh, it's equal to c squared. Do I really know this truth, or am I just functioning as a kind of parrot who is just repeating things that I've heard without really understanding them? But if I'm going to understand them, then I need not only to hear the truth, I need to hear the reasons for the truth. And so better education is going to include not only the truth, but the reasons for the truth, and develop the argument for the truth. So some people will go on to argue in better fashion. Well, okay, let them be taught the ground of their opinion. So we're going to teach the truth and the reasons for the truth. But that person will still say, it doesn't mean that we need to criticize those grounds or present them different ways of looking at things and also refute those ones as well. And they will sometimes then use the example of geometry when we teach geometry. So we will say, here is a theorem, and here's how you prove the theorem. We don't then at the same time in teaching geometry, here are some wrong theorems and show how to disprove those wrong theorems. And so Mill then goes on to say, well, maybe geometry and maybe mathematics is an exception in that case. As long as you are teaching the theorems and the reasons for the theorems, that is going to be sufficient in those cases. But geometry might be an exceptional case to the general rule. And he goes on then to say, but on every subject on which a difference of opinion is possible, the truth depends on a balance to be struck between two sets of conflicting reasons. So we go into physics and chemistry and biology, the geocentric versus the heliocentric model, phlogiston versus oxygen, and so on. It's not simply enough, whichever of those theories is true, to teach it and the reasons for it. There is a difference of opinion among educated people in the sciences, and students and even the scientists themselves need to be exposed to the contrary opinions and exercise their best judgment once they are aware of the arguments and counter-arguments for each position. And it gets even more essential that we have that as our social policy when we get to matters that are more complicated. When we turn to subjects infinitely more complicated, to morals, religion, politics, social relations, and the business of life, 3/4 of the arguments for every disputed opinion consist in dispelling the appearances which favor some opinion different from it. And he gives an examples then from Demosthenes and Cicero, the two great orators in history, when they are presenting arguments publicly on political matters, or they are going into the courts and they're going to argue some civil case or some sort of criminal case. Good practice, and actually essential practice, on all of those complicated political matters and legal matters. The only way you can be prepared going into court is by looking not only at the position that you are going to argue and all of the arguments for it, but you also have to know what the opposition is going to argue and all of their arguments for their position. And not only that, if you're still going to maintain your position, you not only have to know what the opponent's position is going to be and all of the arguments for it, you have to have good arguments against all of their arguments. And not only that, you have to know what kind of arguments they're going to make against your position and have arguments ready to go in countering those. All of that requires that you have a free mind, that you don't just dogmatically believe one set of opinions. And it's also going to be extraordinarily helpful if you can rehearse and practice, get together with other lawyers, right, in preparation for the case, and say, this is the argument that I'm going to make, and ask them to subject to as much criticism as possible, and then to put yourself in the shoes of the opposite side, and ask your colleagues to pretend to be the opposite side and come up with the best arguments on the other side. That's the only way progress in legal affairs and then more political affairs is going to be able to make. He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good, and no one may have been able to refute them. But if he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion. And then Mill goes on to argue, particularly in the context of education, and here he has the liberal education ideal, where we will have a number of teachers or a number of professors in a department. And the point is going to be that the students, if they're going to become up to speed and hopefully themselves become experts in that area, what those students need desperately is to hear arguments from people who have differences of opinion. So different political persuasions, different religious persuasions, different philosophical persuasions, different persuasions in any of the sciences, that what students need to see is smart people and their arguments in collision with each other. That's what genuine education is going to consist in. Okay, now I'm going to jump down a little bit. Suppose we then say, what has happened historically to movements that have adopted free speech policies compared to those who have not adopted free speech policies, even if those movements have had a number of beliefs that are true, and even if they are substantially true. If it is the case that they start off, and usually they have to start off this way, they are a minority position, and they have to argue, and they're aware that there is majority positions that are out there, and they are criticized by those majority positions, and they're trying to gain converts to their own position, and so they have to have their own arguments and be able to present them persuasively to people who don't yet believe, and they also have to know that people are attracted to the majority opinion and have good counter arguments and know what the majority opinions are going to argue back against them. So they have to, as a matter of default, enter into that mode of thinking and argumentation if they are going to make progress socially. Now, what happens, though, when they are successful at doing so and they themselves become the majority opinion? And what Mill goes on to argue is that there is a deadly danger to the movement, even if it is mostly a true movement, if once it becomes the majority opinion, it stops practicing its beliefs in the same manner by which it came to be the majority opinion in the first place. Rather, they become lazy, they become complacent, they start just announcing their beliefs as matters of dogma and expecting others to believe them as matters of dogma. And what Mill says, that's almost always the sign of the death sentence being self-imposed on that movement. It is setting itself up for decline and ultimate failure. History is full of examples. This paragraph here. It is illustrated in the experience of almost all ethical doctrines and religious creeds. They are full of meaning and vitality to those who originate them and to the direct disciples of the originators. Their meaning continues to be felt in undiminished strength and is perhaps brought out into even fuller consciousness so long as the struggle lasts to give the doctrine or creed an ascendancy over other creeds. At last, it either prevails and becomes the general opinion, or its progress stops. It keeps its possession of the ground it has gained, but ceases to spread further. Now, here's the danger. When either of these results has become apparent, controversy on the subject flags and gradually dies away, so people stop arguing about it anymore. The doctrine has taken its place, if not as a received opinion, as one of the admitted sects or divisions of opinion. And then there's a psychological change that goes on in the believers in that doctrine. Instead of being, as at first, constantly on the alert, either to defend themselves against the world or to bring the world over to them, they have subsided into acquiescence, and neither listen, when they can help it, to arguments against their creed, nor trouble dissentients, if there be such, with arguments in its favor. From this time may usually be dated the decline in the living power of the doctrine. It becomes a dogma and slowly dies. Both teachers and learners go to sleep at their post as soon as there is no enemy in the field. And now, that's then to say, even if your doctrines are true, whatever it is that you believe are true, in order to keep them vigorous and alive and alert in your thinking and in the thinking of other people who believe like you in your social movement, you want enemies, you want disbelievers, you want critics. They're going to keep you on your toes. They're going to keep your doctrine alive. So if, by contrast, you have a true opinion and some social power, and you use that social power to censor all of your critics, you are doing yourself a disservice. You are setting yourself up for the death of dogmatism. All right, now Mill then goes on to say that we've considered two possibilities. There's one third one that he options here. It could be, of course, that the belief is true, but we censor it anyway. It could, of course, be that the belief is false and we censor it. He's now argued that in both cases the consequences of doing so are bad. But he then wants to argue that there's a third possibility, and in fact, it's probably the most common possibility on most complicated matters. And that's jumped to here. But there is a commoner case than either of these, when the conflicting doctrines, instead of being one true and the other false, share the truth between them. So that is then to say, on some political matter, you've got this political party and this political party, but this political party has 50 doctrines and this political party has 50 differing doctrines. But it's probably the case, this one's got 28 true doctrines and 22 not so good doctrines, and the other side has 22 good doctrines and 28 not so good doctrines. But if we're going to make progress on politics, what we need to do is have some way of sorting out the good from the bad in this package and sorting out the good from the bad from that package. And the only way that we're going to be able to do so is by letting the two sides have vigorous debate and arguments and to criticize each other, and then hopefully again we will make that gradual progress where the worse opinions will be out-argued and they will drop away. The better opinions will prevail and more people will come to believe them, but even so they will continue to be challenged in each subsequent generation, and that's going to keep them alive, and that's how we make healthy progress. So Mill then moves on to his conclusion. First, if any opinion is compelled to silence, that opinion may, for all we know, for certainty, be true. Huge number of examples of people thinking they have the truth and suppressing something they think to be false, but it turns out to be true. Be aware of that danger. Second, though the silence opinion be an error, it may and commonly does contain a portion of the truth. Okay, and the prevailing opinion, even if it's true, is never the whole truth. It is only by the collision of those adverse opinions that the remainder of the truth has any chance of being supplied. Third, even if our opinion is true and the whole truth, we still want it to be challenged by false opinions in order to keep it alive, to keep it vigorous. And that means that we need, in all three cases, to have a policy of free speech so that the free thinking that is necessarily going to go on in the minds of each individual, and the cultivating of the good judgment in the minds of each individual, and then hopefully in a majority of the people, we can continue to make progress on those dimensions.